Seen all the Best Picture nominees, so let's talk about Triangle of Sadness. What is it? It's a black comedy that satirizes influencers, the ultra-rich, and the power dynamics between people, and how wealth affects those power dynamics. The story plays out in 3 parts. The first is set in the world of high fashion and follows a couple of models who are dating, Yaya and Carl. The second part, and the longest section, takes place on a yacht as Yaya and Carl are comped a super fancy cruise in exchange for posting about it, or however influencers work. There, the scope of the movie expands to other characters who are also on the yacht, including a Russian fertilizer baron, a British couple that made their fortune in landmines, the comically obsequious crew of the ship, and the drunken captain whose casting I won't spoil, but is a real treat. The third part of the movie takes place in a third setting that I also won't spoil, but if you weren't already hip to what the movie's doing by this point, it gets pretty on the nose in the last third. Not in a way that bothered me, but, obviousness bothers some people. Who is it made by? Triangle of Sadness is written and directed by a Swedish filmmaker named Ruben Östlund, and if you've been following, award season movie news for the last few years, you may have already heard of Ruben Östlund. He made a black comedy in 2014 called Force Majeure that was very well received both internationally and by US critics. They even remade it in English, but Östlund wasn't a part of that, and I hear it's not great. He made another black comedy called The Square in 2017, and that was nominated for Best International Feature at the Oscars, and it won the extremely prestigious Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. How has it been received? Triangle of Sadness also won the extremely prestigious Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival last year. So Ruben Östlund is one of only 9 directors to have ever won the Palme d'Or twice. Is Ruben Östlund in the same league as Michel Haneke and Francis Ford Coppola, who have also won it twice? Or for whatever reason, do the French just really respond to his movies? Hard to say. I will say that Triangle of Sadness, while receiving positive reviews, it's not as universally acclaimed as some of the other Best Picture nominees, and you get the sense that critics definitely liked Force Majeure and The Square more than this. But I haven't seen either of those, but I've read that the satire there was a lot sharper, and I believe that. Here, it gets a little obvious at times, a little blunt, especially in the last third, and yet it's nominated for Best Picture, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Director, so that's certainly something. Who would like this? The French, apparently. Or at least the jury at Cannes. People who, when you call them a socialist, correct you and say, actually, I'm a Marxist. The movie does go to those kinds of places. People who like potty humor, of which there is a shocking amount. You may be expecting a stuffy European quote-unquote comedy, but trust me, there's more shit and vomit in this than you will know what to do with. More in part 2. Seen all the Best Picture nominees, so let's talk about Triangle of Sadness. As I said in the first TikTok, this movie takes place in 3 parts, and the second and longest of those parts takes place on a yacht. The first chunk of this section is largely about the obliviousness of the ultra-rich, particularly when they're interacting with not rich people whose job it is to serve them on this yacht. But the main plot point of this section plays out in an extended set piece that's kind of the centerpiece of the movie, and it involves a ton of bodily fluids. A ton. This is the most shit I saw in a movie last year, and as a reminder, a Jackass movie came out last year. So if you have a weak stomach, beware. But I'll say it's far more than just, oh look, they're all puking and shitting themselves. Isn't that hilarious? I think it's a bit deeper than that. Twofold. Number one, this occurs at an extremely fancy dinner. In fact, it's the fanciest dinner of the cruise, and this is on a $250 million yacht, so that level of fancy. So there's an enormous contrast between the high culture setting and the low-brow humor. And it's the ultra-rich people being brought down a peg. It's something of an equalizer. Yes, you may be a billionaire, but choppy waters still makes you seasick like everyone else. So you're gonna puke and shit yourself whether you have $1 billion or you have student loans. The other thing happening here is a loss of control. Again, these are obscenely wealthy people who are used to getting their way, who are used to being able to bend both society and the people around them to their will. And then suddenly they can't control their stomachs or their bowels. And this sequence goes on for a long time, a very long time. And there's a wonderful escalation of how bad things get. It starts with one person needing to swallow some vomit in reaction to choppy waters, and then it builds and builds and builds until the hallways of the ship are full of excrement. It just escalates, escalates, escalates. And then, just as this nightmare evening is ending, the camera pulls out from the ship and continues to pull out and continues to pull out until it reveals something that I won't spoil, that is an even bigger escalation of this loss of control for these people. And that leads into the third section of the movie, which again I won't spoil, which is the culmination of this loss of control for these ultra-rich characters. Seen all the Best Picture nominees, so let's talk about Triangle of Sadness. Yes, this is a satire of the ultra-rich, but I think this movie is really about power dynamics, both in a micro sense, like between individuals, but also in a larger macro sense, like how society works. The first section in particular pokes at the quote-unquote rules that govern the power dynamics between individuals. This section takes place in the world of high-end fashion modeling and mostly follows Carl, a male model, and his girlfriend Yaya, a female model who makes more money than him. The longest scene in this section is an extended fight that Carl and Yaya have about who pays the bill at a fancy restaurant they go to. Carl eventually pays, but he's resentful of the fact that that's such a gendered dynamic, especially because their industry values Yaya as a woman more than him as a man and pays them accordingly. What Carl's actually upset about is that Yaya has financial power over him, but the rules of society are built to accommodate the much more common scenario where the man has more money than the woman. Yaya eventually throws this back in Carl's face, basically explaining that whatever power she has as a model is extremely temporary, because the second she hits a certain age, the power dynamic shifts and not in her favor. So the first section explores individual power dynamics, and then the second and especially the third sections are more about societal power dynamics. These sections are examining who in society has power, who gets to boss around who, and why are they the ones that get to do the bossing. For reasons I won't spoil, the rules of society and the existing power dynamics kind of go out the window in the third section. Or rather, they're inverted. The power dynamics are turned on their head. And yet, part of the movie's commentary is how desperate the characters are to preserve those rules and preserve the status quo, even though the world has been completely turned upside down and it makes no fucking sense to maintain the rules that were there before. And that goes for both macro societal power dynamics and the micro individual power dynamics. Carl and Yaya take a bit of a backseat in the second section, but in the third section, Carl gains a bit of power over Yaya. And much like in the first section, it's a very gendered power dynamic, which I find to be very amusing. But Yaya is still clinging to the old rules of society, insisting they still apply, and they don't.